Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 9 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Buffalo Sabres, in which the Sharks have won 5-3. So after the previous game against the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks suddenly were playing without 7 of their usual roster players, it didn't seem like things could get too much worse roster-wise going into this next game 3 days later against the Buffalo Sabres, and you could argue whether or not it did get worse, but it certainly didn't get much better. While both Couture and Dahlin did return for tonight's game, Meier would end up replacing Dahlin in COVID protocol and was joined by Kevin Labanc, so neither of those two players managed to play in this game. So if you were looking for a game that had more of a complete San Jose Sharks roster compared to a San Jose Barracuda roster, well, you didn't really come to the right place. If you were looking for a good team game from the San Jose Sharks, however, you did come to the right place, because this was one of the better wins for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. In fact, this was the only win that when the Sharks came in holding a lead in the third period, instead of just kind of holding the lead, being hemmed in their own zone, and kind of just squeaking out the 1 or 2 goal victory, the Sharks actually pushed the pace in the third period and ended up opening up a larger lead for themselves. But getting ahead of myself, as we start in the first period, the Sharks would score the first goal of this game. Dahlin, in his first game back after missing the previous one due to being in the COVID protocol, manages to score on this new sort of makeshift first line, where he was still joined by his usual line mate Logan Couture, but with Timo Meier out, it ended up being William Eklund filling in, and Eklund would end up getting an assist on this goal. The Sabres would rather quickly respond with the goal of their own on a delayed penalty call against the San Jose Sharks, with Jeff Skinner to make it 1-1, but then it would be Ryan Merkley in his second career game scoring his first career NHL goal as it deflected in off of the skate of a Sabres player, and it was 2-1 San Jose in a pretty well played first period, and that would do it for the first 20 minutes of this game. Moving into the second period, the Sharks would get the first goal there, and that would be from Tomas Hertl. A very nice move in front to put the Sharks up 3-1, but again it would be Kajula responding rather quickly for the Sabres to then make it 3-2, and that would do it for the second period scoring. So as I said, the Sharks came in with a lead in the third period, and especially with the depleted roster that they have, it wouldn't have been that much of a surprise if they kind of ended up on their heels a bit in their own defensive zone trying to hold on to this 1-goal lead, but instead they actually ended up pushing the pace. And this is somewhat of a comment on how the Buffalo Sabres as a whole played tonight, but this is also a large comment about how the San Jose Sharks were able to band together and play a full and complete 60 minutes here tonight. They would add goals from Mario Ferraro, a very nice play executed by the Sharks' fourth line, which was quite nice to see to make it 4-2 San Jose. Then Tomas Hertl would somehow one-up the goal he scored previously, which was already a very nice move, with a goal of the year candidate, as he just completely dekes out Rasmus Dahlin, former first overall pick Rasmus Dahlin, I should add, and it was 5-2 San Jose. The Sabres would get one back off of a strange bounce, with Jeff Skinner scoring his second of the game to make it somewhat close at the end, and the Sabres, honestly, with the goal he pulled, looked pretty good and almost came within just a couple of inches of scoring another goal to maybe make this game even more interesting, but in the end the Sharks would hold on for the 5-3 win. Moving on to the lineup, as I said, a new makeshift first line with Timo Meier on the sidelines for this game. It was Couture and Dahlin joined by Eklund here, and how did this go? Well, coming into the game, I was very excited to see how it would work, and Couture and Dahlin still maintained some very nice chemistry between them, but Eklund kind of seemed like an odd one out on this line. It wasn't that he was bad in this game, but it definitely seemed to be a bit of a step back. Like, Eklund was kind of working pretty well with the players he had been with in the past couple of games, but in this one, just things didn't necessarily work too well. So while Couture and Dahlin both still looked pretty good, I was a bit disappointed with Eklund's performance. I thought also defensively was maybe a big issue for Eklund in this game. A couple of very suspect defensive moves, one where he tried to make like a back pass to his defenseman, but it got picked off and ended up leading to a very good Buffalo Sabres chance. So generally, it wasn't an awful game, but not as good as we could have expected, and this was likely one of the first games this season, potentially even the first game this season, where the Sharks' first line, if you want to call this the first line, was not their best line of the game, because their best line was the Tomas Hertl line, which was the Sharks' second line for this one, with Hertl, Balcers, and Barabanov. Starting off with Rudolf Balcers, he had a pretty rough start to the season. I'd say the first few games of this year, 4 or 5, where he just kind of looked completely off, wasn't really doing anything for the Sharks at all. But in these past 3-4 games, he's actually been getting a massive amount of chances, but just really hasn't been able to bury much of any of them. And it's only a matter of time where the floodgates open and he manages to add goal after goal after goal, because he keeps putting himself in great position and keeps getting set up by players into great positions to be able to score a goal, but he either just doesn't get a great shot away or he gets robbed by the goaltender, things like this. But it was a great game from Balcers, and also a very good game from Barabanov. After the first couple of games of the season for Barabanov, which weren't particularly good, he really stepped up in the previous one against the Winnipeg Jets, and here tonight he continued that performance. A very solid game for Barabanov. As I said, he made up a third of what was the Sharks' best line here tonight, and potentially the best line of this entire game, counting even the Sabres lines. But obviously the big story here tonight was Tomas Hertl. He gets 3 points here. His 2 goals were both off of fantastic moves, was setting up some great plays. He was one of those guys really setting up Balcers for those great chances he was unable to bury. And just generally, while Hertl had been overshadowed by Logan Couture through the first few games of this year, the first 8 games of this year, I guess 7 because Couture didn't play last night or the other night, but Hertl finally kind of showing up and actually playing a fantastic game, potentially the Sharks' best player here tonight. Moving on to the third line, this was the line I was the most disappointed in. Bonino, he was a player I was so high on earlier this season, right? Back when the Sharks were on that 4-game winning streak to start the year, I was talking about how Bonino was such a strong defensive force for the San Jose Sharks, and he was doing a good job at keeping, opposing players to the perimeter. And so even though the goals weren't there, they were probably going to come. But now it's another 5 games later. The defensive side of the game has gotten slightly worse, I would say. He seems to be, not necessarily hemmed in his own zone, but keeping the other team to the perimeter, but kind of hemmed into his own zone and allowing a lot of movement through the middle, I would say. And the goal scoring still really hasn't caught up. So Bonino still a signing that I do like from Doug Wilson during this offseason, but I'm kind of at my wit's end a bit here, trying to just wait for the moment where Bonino really brings that extra gear that makes me think, okay, this guy is a very, very good third-line center for the San Jose Sharks, because right now it's been a bit lagging behind over these past few games. I've still definitely been a fan of Andrew Cogliano's performance, so not necessarily much to say about him. I just like his speed and tenacity in this game, even if, he was, of course, part of this line that kind of got stuck in their own zone a decent amount of time. Lane Peterson ended up actually getting boosted up to this third line after a very, very, very nice performance from him in the previous game against the Winnipeg Jets. And I thought Peterson continued to show off some pretty nice moves in this game, had a couple of nice offensive flair type of moments, but of course, like I said with Cogliano, like I said with Bonino, he made up this not so great line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight, so he can't really escape that type of criticism of not being so great in the defensive zone. When it comes to the fourth line, honestly, this line didn't do too much except set up this very nice Ferraro goal. I have to give a lot of credit to this duo of Weatherby and Nick Merkley, because they were the 2 players who really set up this goal. Weatherby holding it behind his own net, tied up with one of the Sabres players, and then Nick Merkley just makes a very, very slick, small, but very important play to free this puck up slightly in this battle, which allowed Weatherby to actually work this puck over to Ferraro, who would end up scoring it past Craig Anderson. It was a very subtle play, but it was still very well executed, so I definitely liked that from the fourth line. Otherwise, I thought Weatherby was probably the best player of this line. John Leonard, if you told me he didn't play, I wouldn't have even been, I wouldn't be surprised, because he was very, very unapparent in this game. Nick Merkley, kind of similar, but because he had that nice play on the Mario Ferraro goal, I am a bit more forgiving. What I did find interesting is that Gadjevich ended up coming out of the lineup for this game, and Nick Merkley actually managed to retain his spot. That was a bit strange to me, but, no matter. It doesn't necessarily matter. I didn't think Gadjevich was particularly strong against the Winnipeg Jets, so it's kind of just a coach's decision at that point, and I don't have a problem with Nick Merkley being in the lineup. On the defensive side of things, while there were a couple of players returning for the Sharks at forward, Couture and Dahlin, there were no players returning for the San Jose Sharks on the defensive side of things, so Ferraro and Brent Burns both leading the way once again, and the other 4 fill-in defensemen still ended up playing in this game: Milosh, Hataka, Megna, and Merkley. Starting off with that first pairing, they actually had a particularly strong game here tonight, which is good. Like they did in the previous game, they really needed to step up because of the fact that they were the only two consistent NHLers in the Sharks defensive core over these past couple of games, and so it's definitely nice to see. Ferraro in particular, I thought, looked extremely strong here tonight. Burns had a couple of issues in the defensive zone, but I guess you could say it was mostly good. There was this one shift early on in the second period where he gave the puck away about 3 times in a 30-second span, which in the defensive zone, which was not good. But I guess you could say otherwise it wasn't too bad. And I should comment that even though the defensive game, not insane, the offensive game I definitely liked from Brent Burns, definitely roaming around the ice a lot, and that was good to see. On to the other 4 defensemen. I talked about in my previous game against the Winnipeg Jets that Jacob Megna was probably the most impressive of the 4 defensemen, and that definitely was something that the coach, John McLean, filling in for Bob Booner, of course, agreed with in this game, because this is obviously a slight part because of the fact that Hataka seemed to go down with some sort of undisclosed injury and only ended up playing about 7.5 minutes here tonight. But Jacob Megna ended up with almost 24 minutes of ice time for this game. So as I said, he was the best of those 4 defensemen for the Sharks in the previous game. McLean absolutely agreeing with that. He gets 24 minutes here tonight, which is just absolutely crazy. And it does begin to beg the question of whether or not, when Shemek and Vlasic are actually off the COVID protocol list, whether or not they actually managed to earn a spot back into the lineup. The Sharks, these past couple of wins have actually been rather solid for them, and not too bad defensively, at least not at all nearly what people were expecting with these 4 inexperienced players stepping into the lineup for the San Jose Sharks. And so the fact that Megna can play a pretty solid 24 minutes, and you take a look at Shemek and Vlasic when they were in the lineup giving a half-decent 12 to 13 minutes, it definitely says a lot about the dichotomy between those two players, or I guess 3 players, you could say. Another player to obviously talk about would be Ryan Merkley. I talked about how in the previous game against the Winnipeg Jets, he kind of looked a bit disengaged and uninterested in the game. Here tonight, he actually had his family in attendance, so I was expecting at least a slightly better game from Ryan Merkley, and I actually got a much better game from Merkley. Once he scored that goal in the first period, his first career goal at the NHL level, it definitely seemed to wake him up a bit. He just immediately on, I believe it was his next shift, he made some incredible moves at the blue line and almost set up yet another goal for, at least his line mates, the players on the ice, and just generally was making a lot more offensive maneuvers. In the Winnipeg Jets game, he had maybe one moment in the offensive zone where he looked okay and nothing really came of that. Here tonight, you could probably say 4 or 5 moments in the offensive zone, and considering he only played about 13 minutes here tonight, that was rather impressive. So while with Megna, I can technically see a situation where maybe he ends up replacing someone like Shemek or Vlasic, I don't necessarily see the same thing happening with Ryan Merkley. I suspect he ends up going back down to the Barracuda once the Sharks get fully healthy again, but it is definitely nice to see him get some NHL experience, and I'm sure he's happy with that. When it comes to the other 2 defensemen, as I said, Hataka kind of stepped out with this one with some sort of undisclosed injury. Not really sure what to say about him. And Milosh, honestly, not looking too great here tonight, but I guess not the end of the world either. When it comes to the goaltending, James Reimer got a second straight start here, so clearly right now the Sharks are leaning more towards James Reimer than towards Adin Hill, and I honestly cannot blame them with how Reimer has played and with how Hill has played thus far this season. Reimer does let up 3 goals in this game, but hard to really blame him for many of them. This first goal by Jeff Skinner was through maybe 5 people screening him in front. You could just see on the replay that Reimer having to look just across a sea of bodies to be able to see this shot, and ends up being a seeing eye shot that goes by him into the net, so hard to blame him there. And then this Drake Kajula shot was just like a 1 in a million slap shot to the top, just like a pristine top corner slap shot. Kind of an insane opportunity that you won't really see all that much, especially from a player like Drake Kajula, no offense to him. So a difficult shot for James Reimer to stop. And then when it comes to this third goal, it was just kind of a strange situation. You could say maybe James Reimer had to be more spatially aware, but in the end, I'm not too mad. 3 goals let in for Reimer, but none necessarily awful, and so honestly, with the game coming up on Thursday against the St. Louis Blues, especially since the St. Louis Blues are a very, very strong team, I wouldn't be surprised to see James Reimer get yet another consecutive start for that one. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. As I said, they'll take on the Blues, and this is going to be their toughest task thus far this season. The Sharks have played some pretty good teams, here tonight, even though most people thought the Sabres were going to be bad this year. The Sabres came in, I believe, with a 5-2-1 record. The Sharks faced off against the Winnipeg Jets in that previous game as well, and they came in with, I believe, a 4-2-1 record. So the Sharks have been playing some pretty good teams, but the St. Louis Blues are coming in as, a very, very strong team. They were one of the last undefeated teams at the NHL level. I believe only the Hurricanes and Panthers lasted undefeated longer than the Blues. And so this is going to be a true test for the Sharks, and considering the COVID protocol list doesn't seem to be getting much shorter, it'll actually be a true test for the Barracuda as well. Class dismissed.